Hi there! Welcome back to my channel. My name is Ivana. It's been a while. I don't want to spend too much time explaining what happened, but I have some happy news. I am now a school librarian, which is a dream job, but it also means that I have to go back to school. So I've been working full-time and studying part-time, and it's been a little challenging. Such an amazing opportunity, but also a really big learning curve, and that hopefully explains my hiatus. It's a long weekend right now. It's Indigenous Peoples Day, and I had 2 papers due this week, and I'm not gonna lie, I might have had a mental breakdown, but we're gonna persist, and I'm going to talk about the books that I have read recently. I have 2 more of these wrap-ups coming up. My reading journal has seen better days. It is falling apart, but it's almost done, which is so exciting, and I'm glad that I took notes because some of these books I read in June. I hope you have a nice bevy. This is kind of the world's most mediocre cold brew, but it's gonna help. Today I'm gonna talk about 3 different types of books. The first is books about books. The second is books about girlhood. And the last thing I'm gonna talk about are some graphic novels. So let's start with books about books. I feel like this is a genre that I'm starting to really get into. I have a special place in my heart for slice of life books or any books that have to do with finding yourself at the bookstore or at the library. And the first book I want to talk about is 84 Charing Cross Road by Helene Hanff. This book was deeply influenced by Ariel Bisset of Books Unbound, the podcast, which I highly recommend. And this is a delightful little book. I listened to it in one sitting, and I also physically read it while I listened to it. I think it was no longer than 2 hours, and I never listened to an audiobook at regular speed, so it was short, but it really left a mark on me. This is a true story of male correspondence between a United Statesian woman named Helene and a British man who worked at a UK bookseller named Marks & Co. Booksellers. And honestly, it starts out with just them, and then other people in the bookstore get involved. I really want to chat with Helene because Helene sends care packages and things like that. The letters start in the year 1949 and end in the year 1969. I think there is a sequel or a second part, but the way that it ended, I'm not gonna lie, I did shed a little tear because I just loved getting to know all the people in the bookstore and Helene herself. She's really hilarious, if a bit self-indulgent, but it was so wonderful to see this friendship grow. Helene was a really kind and genuine person. Like I said, she would send packages to the folks at the bookstore, and she was really adamant that they buy specific books, and she was just one of a kind. I loved seeing the letters go from being extremely formal to being extremely informal, and just how you communicate differently when you really know a person very intimately. I truly started reading this book because I thought it was a love story. Like, I thought they would fall in love over correspondence, and even though it's not about romantic love, it is about friendship and love for books, and I think it is a very worthwhile book to read if you're really into books and reading, and you probably are because you're here. So I really can't recommend it enough if you need a little pick-me-up, or if you need something to read on a wintry or rainy day. It's just cozy. And speaking of cozy, our second book about books is Welcome to the HYUNAM-DONG bookshop. I impulsively, well, not so impulsively, I had been waiting for this from the library for a really long time, and by a really long time I probably mean like a couple weeks, and I just was in the mood to read something nice and warm and sweet. And I went to a new bookstore in the Somerville area, so it's the greater Boston area in Davis Square. It's called Narrative Bookshop, and I cannot recommend it enough. And Mila, the owner, is just the sweetest. I think you should follow them on Instagram. The store has such a good selection, and I was specifically looking for books translated by women, and I realized that this was at the top of my TBR. I cannot get over the cute cover, the colors. There are also cute little illustrations of a dog at the end of every chapter, like at the bottom. And honestly, I have the book somewhere, but this room is kind of a mess right now, so I'm just going to show you some of the illustrations and maybe I'll take a picture. The book was just something that felt really up my alley, and I was in the mood for something slow when I picked it up, and it is slow. It's slice of life. This book I read mostly on a train from Boston to Connecticut, and I was visiting my in-laws, and it was just such a good way to pass the time. This book is originally in Korean, and it follows a woman named Jew who's in her 30s, and she decides to open a bookshop that is just tucked away in a corner in a neighborhood and just start over. We know that something happened to her, but she doesn't really reveal that until later, and she's just trying to find herself and make ends meet with this bookstore because it's always been a dream of hers to start a bookstore. It also follows the lives of the people who work there, the patrons and friends, and the bookstore is also a coffee shop, so there's a lot of talk about coffee because one of the employees, or the main employee that she hires, is really into coffee and coffee beans specifically, and it gets really deeply into that. The book is truly a healing book. It's about how different people find themselves in this bookstore. I think that can border on cheesy and preachy, but I didn't feel that way. I came to it with an open mind, and I hope that whoever decides to read it does too. The chapters in this book are episodic, and I found it a little bit annoying. Like, the title of each chapter repeated a phrase that was said in the chapter, because I feel like when you do that over and over and over again, it gets old. So that was something I didn't like. My notes about this book are a little all over the place, so I'm just gonna share some observations. I loved how this book criticized grind culture and hyper focusing on being productive all the time. I think that can border on cliche, and it does feel a little repetitive about it, but as someone who grew up with that mindset and who's trying to unlearn it, I love the repetition because I am constantly feeling guilty when I'm not being productive. I love the focus that it has on healing, like I said, but also how books can heal you. So it's not just other people. You can find yourself through your friendships and relationships with other people, but books can also guide you when you're in a time of need. It also mentions a lot of books that are translated, and I added a ton of books to my TBR because of this book, including Monika Maran's Animal Triste. I am probably butchering all that, but it's French. This book also feels very meta because it keeps saying, like, you don't have to remember every single little point of every book you read. It's really about how it made you feel. And if the book made you feel something and if it really touched you, it doesn't matter if you can't recall the plot. It reminds me to give myself a little grace because these books I read a while back and I'm sharing them with you. I also love the main character's musings. I think she's popular on Instagram and she has a lot of very deep captions and thoughts and musings on life and books. And then there's also a character of an author that comes into the bookstore that she ultimately interviews, and those interview conversations are really interesting. There's also a character that just likes to sit at the bookstore in the coffee shop section and knit and people watch, and how that makes her feel less alone. And I'm the kind of person who loves to look out a window and people watch as well, so that validated me. And then this whole notion of how you don't have to be extraordinary. I think that that's something that was drilled into me from a young age, that I had to be extraordinary, that I had to be the best, that if I worked hard enough, everything would just fall into place. And I don't want to be extraordinary. I just want to live my life and be content. And again, it feels really validating to see that in a book. Now, yeah, this book was mad cheesy. It was so cheesy, but it was so comforting. And I'm gonna leave you with a line from the book. A life surrounded by good people is a successful life. It might not be success as defined by society, but thanks to the people around you, each day is a successful day. Next up are some books that focus on girlhood. So when I mean girlhood, I mean what it's like to be a girl, what it's like to grow up into a woman, just how fun it is to be a girl sometimes. A lot of these books just touch me, and I like reading about adolescence and girlhood and women. First book I want to talk about in this category is Marlena by Julie Buntin. This book was personally recommended to me by Haley Jakobson, the author of one of my 2023 favorites, Old Enough. She had like a Ask Me Anything on stories, and I asked her what were some lookalikes of Old Enough, and one of the books she recommended was Marlena, which I had never heard about. I think this book came out in the late 2010s, and it follows a girl named Kat who is 15. Her mom gets a divorce and moves Kat to a rural part of town, and Kat just becomes totally infatuated with her next door neighbor, a girl named Marlena. Now Marlena's a little bit older, she has a lot going on, her dad is into some sketchy things, and Kat is just so mesmerized by her. This book has a lot of trigger warnings. I would highly recommend you check Storygraph for those because there's a lot going on, but it's well worth it. The story is a little depressing. It goes back and forth between present day Kat and the past when she was an adolescent and she was discovering who she was and kind of mimicking Marlena. There were so many profound passages in this book. I just saw myself so much in Kat and Marlena and their friendship. I'm just gonna read you a quote that captures the essence of this book. Great loneliness, profound isolation, a cataclysmic, overpowering sense of being misunderstood. When does that kind of deep feeling just stop? At 15, the world ended over and over again. To be so young is a kind of self-violence, no foresight, an inflated sense of wisdom, and yet you're still responsible for your mistakes. It's a little frightening to remember just how much and how precisely I felt. Now, if the world really did end, I think I'd feel numb. Yeah, any book about reckless teenagerhood, is that a word? Any book about reckless teenagehood, about not thinking about the consequences of your actions, about just doing a bunch of dumb, it all speaks to me because I was that kid. And it truly is wild how much being a teenager shapes who you are for the rest of your life. Like, there's another line, I'm sorry. There's another line that goes, when you grow up, who you were as a teenager either takes on a mythical importance or it's completely laughable. I wanted to be the kind of person who wiped those years away. Instead, I feared they defined me. I think that being a teenager can be really, really heartbreaking. You have your first love, your first heartbreaks. You get to learn a lot about who you are as a person, especially growing up in a society as a girl. It's just really, really tough. All of the things that you're expected to do or not to do. For some reason, this book just kept reminding me of when I was like 13 or 14. My brother and I would drive around with our friends and we would go around to different like water fountains, not like drinkable water fountains, but just like statues with fountains on them or whatever in public places, and we would just pour detergent on them and see what happened, and it was so fun. But also so dumb and also illegal. Again, which thinking back on that, I laugh, but then I also think of all the ways that I hurt myself and how mean I was to myself, and it just makes me really sad. So even when I was reflecting on this book, it just put me in a bad place, but also made me realize how far I've come as a person. So yeah, that is Marlena. I really, really recommend it. Okay, the next book I read was Milk, Blood, Heat, and I cannot believe I had been sleeping on this book because it's so freaking good. I absolutely love this book. I started reading it on a plane and I finished it poolside, and it just hit me so hard. It follows different Black women and girls in the state of Florida, and it is just a really edgy, like intriguing book. I visited my sister at the end of June. I was looking for books that were very Florida, and I think this book is so Florida. And I feel like that can feel like an insult, but I just wanted something atmospheric and something that felt hot and clammy and suffocating sometimes. So I enjoyed this a lot. I read this on Kindle. I got it from the library. I highlighted a lot, and I think the reason why I never bought this book is because I think the cover is so ugly. The cover I'm going to show you is not the cover for the US, and I just feel like the cover doesn't do it any justice. I don't like the colors. It doesn't scream read me. And I do judge a book by its cover. It's really bad, but I do. So this book was creepy. It dealt with mother-daughter relationships. It was about death. It was about the recklessness of girls and teenage girls and tweens. It deals with religion, sexism, the heat in Florida. I think I enjoyed all the stories except for one, which is like really rare, and the one I didn't enjoy I think was short, and I want to say it was sci-fi related, but don't quote me on that because I do like sci-fi, but I don't think I got it. Maybe I'm not smart enough for it, but this was a stellar collection of short stories. My favorite story in this collection was titled The Hearts of Our Enemies, and it's about a mother. She has a really complicated relationship with her daughter because of something the mom did. The mom finds out that the daughter is being groomed by a teacher, and she goes to his house and she knocks on that door, and I'm not gonna share anything else. Between reading Milk, Blood, Heat and They Fell Like Stars from the Sky, I really have a lot of hope for short story collections, and I want to read more of them. I recently bought another short story collection called Mouth, and it was inspired by Kat from Lit with Kat, and I can't wait to read that one because it's also supposed to be creepy. Yeah, I'm ready to tackle more short story collections. The next book about girlhood that I read was Magnolia Wu Unfolds It All by Chanel Miller. Now, I think I talked about this book in my mid-year freakout tag, which feels like ages ago. This book was so adorable. It is meant for children. I don't care. I read it in an airport in one sitting. My flight was delayed and I'm a really nervous flyer, and this really settled my nerves. I listened to it on audio, but I also physically read it because it has really great illustrations. And this book was just the cutest. It follows the titular Magnolia Wu as she unfolds mysteries related to socks that were left behind in her parents' laundromat. Magnolia is Asian American. She is very intrepid. She is very precocious, and she is just exploring New York City. If you don't know, Chanel Miller is the author of Know My Name, and ever since reading that book, I've been following her on social media, especially on Instagram. She shares her beautiful illustrations that connect to all of her thoughts and musings on the world, and I just feel like she has so much to say, and I'm so glad that she was able to create this book and share it with the world because it really did brighten my day. In this book, we get to meet laundromat regulars, we get to meet Magnolia's friend. She's trying to figure out how to make friends. Sometimes they get into little tiffs and work things out. There is a happy ending, and again, everything's related to these lost socks, and connecting these lost socks to their owners is what they do. The book was just lovely, and it felt like New York City was its own character. It really came alive. I think that oftentimes when we live in a big city, or really when we are anywhere, every person contains a whole world inside of them, and we often forget that. And this book is a reminder of that, to honor other people and to be mindful that there's more out there than you can even imagine. The next book I read was Annie John, and I feel like with any Jamaica Kincaid book, you just gotta take your time with it. This book was less than 150 pages, and it took me probably a whole week to read because I wanted to dissect every sentence and every paragraph and every single word because there's just so many layers to her writing. So this book follows our titular Annie John, and she is a witty, brilliant young girl as she comes of age in the island of Antigua. The back of this book states that at the heart of this novel, like many of her stories, lies the ambivalent and essential bonds created by a mother's love. So again, it's about growing up. When we're growing up, our mothers or our caregivers are our whole world. And then as we get older, those bonds change for better or worse. Yeah, it's just a book about mothers and daughters. It's also a book about colonialism and imperialism in the Caribbean, of course. It wouldn't be a Jamaica Kincaid novel if it didn't touch upon that. I love how seamless she makes the themes in her novels. Even though both Annie John and the previous book that I read by her, Lucy, are very, very similar in themes, they are very distinct novels. So one thing that I loved about this book is how Kincaid really captures universal experiences, like growing up and no longer being your parents' little girl, or wanting your boobs to get bigger, getting lost in a friendship, looking at yourself in the mirror as you're growing up into an adolescent and not recognizing the person staring back at you. How love and hate are considered to be opposites, but they're really very similar if you really think about them, because a lot of the times you can't hate someone unless you love them. And poor little Annie John definitely has a love-hate relationship with her mother, and some of the things her mother says to her and some of the things she says to her mother, they just broke my heart, but they feel so true to life. I think another universal experience that she captures is how when you really can't stand someone in your family, someone you're close to, someone you love very much, you can criticize them as much as you want, but the second someone else says something, you're like, yo, you're crossing a line, like stop. She also captures how fickle we can be as teenagers with friendships, how we love our friends one day and we're like, I'm over her, like let me hang out with this other person. Annie John really reminded me of Anne of Green Gables too, because she was just so bright, and she was just like, I want to be called Enid. I don't want to be called Annie John. And I know that Anne wanted to be called Cordelia because that name was so much more tragical and poetical. And I feel like, don't we all give ourselves nicknames that we wish other people could call us when we're younger? Or was that just me? So this book was excellent, and I'm gonna leave you with a quote that shows off Annie John's humor when she's overseeing her class when her teacher was absent. So she goes, "I would never dilly-dally with a decision, always making up my mind right away about the thing in front of me. Sometimes, seeing my old frail self in a girl, I would defend her. Sometimes, seeing my old frail self in a girl, I would be heartless and cruel. It went over quite well, and I became very popular." And the last book about girlhood that I would like to talk about is I'm a Fan by Sheena Patel. And this one is girl as in like Girl So Confusing by Charlie XCX and Lord. Or maybe just not the remix version, maybe the original version with just Charlie. So a line that probably encapsulates the unhingedness of this book and the onlineness of this book is, first of all, I didn't miss the red flags. I looked at them and thought, yeah, that's sexy. So in this book, an unnamed protagonist is seeing a philandering man who she nicknames the man I want to be with. She's 30 years old, and she is obsessed with the influencer that the man she wants to be with is seeing. And she calls that woman the woman I'm obsessed with. This book is written in little snippets with little one-liners. It has a lot to say about how we present ourselves online, about parasocial relationships, how people of color might often other themselves for likes, how parasocial relationships can lead to delusion and obsession. And I have to say, I kind of enjoyed how pathologically toxic the main character is. She's definitely a caricature of someone who is constantly online and does some wild. And I'm not gonna lie, I sometimes saw myself in her as someone who was online a lot during quarantine. I think that a lot of her insights regarding being the child of immigrants and othering herself, it just felt overdone and on the nose and really heavy-handed. I don't think she added anything new to that discussion, but I do think that in making that story with a main character who was, I believe, South Asian, and I think that because this book is a unhinged woman book and it doesn't have the typical white protagonist, I do think that it might make the white ladies who tend to read these type of books, it might broaden their horizons perhaps. But for me, it was just kind of cliched. I would be lying if I said that I didn't enjoy how wild she gets and how she even becomes a dog walker so she can come across the woman she's obsessed with's friend or cousin or whatever. Yeah, there's a lot of commentary on being online. If you're into books that have shorter chapters and you don't care if there's no character development, this might be a book for you. But for me, I just felt like I wanted it to be better than it was. And I truly can't believe we're almost at the end. The last books I'm going to talk about are graphic novels. And the first one of these is LUBEIK. And LUBEIK is a workout. She's a thick boy. And I 100% got this because of Monika from Dog-Eared Musings. She did a whole video on it and I really enjoyed it. And I'm going to set it down because it's really heavy. So the first thing I wrote in my journal about this was that I felt duped into buying this because the first couple of pages have beautiful illustrations that are in color, and then the rest of the pages are also beautifully illustrated but are not colorful. They're in black and white, and I think that's how it starts for every chapter. I think it's like a common thing and I should have realized it beforehand, but it's fine. I don't regret buying this book because it honestly is probably one of my favorites of the year. The story was just amazing. First of all, the book is translated from Arabic, and the way that you read the book is how you would read a manga. So it's from right to left because it wants to mimic how you read Arabic. So if you're not going to read it in Arabic, at least you can read it in English from right to left. This book follows 3 interrelated stories set in Egypt in a world where wishes can be purchased and granted. So one of the things that I liked about this book was how amazing the world building was. I absolutely loved that there were 3 different tiers of wishes, and if you had like a first class wish, it's guaranteed to come true. But if you had a third class wish, you were gonna get like half a wish granted, or it would come out all wrong. One of the first pages sold me on this, and it's a woman and she's like weighing herself and she's like, oh, I wish I could lose X amount of pounds or kilos. So she wishes to lose weight, and the way that she loses weight is she loses some of her limbs, and she's like, oh my god, not like that. So that was really, really funny, and that was such a great way to start the book because, you know, there's always a catch with these wishes. This book might be funny, but it also deals with a lot of difficult things like loss and heartache. How do you lead a fulfilling life? Differences in social classes and what you can achieve based on the amount of resources that you have. The characters felt like real people, and I admit that the book went on for a long time. The plot was really long and I was like, where are we going? But the destination was great. I think at the end it was a very compelling and hopeful story that felt very healing. There was a sentient donkey in the story, or was it a horse? I can't remember. It's been a while. And honestly, the story had a lot of depth and complexity, and it really made me think, like, if I could only have one wish granted, what would that be and why? I just highly recommend it if you want something that is out of the box, if you want something that is thought-provoking. And another graphic novel that I read was Mothballs or Naftalina by Sole Otero. I got this book because Kat from Lit with Kat mentioned the English translation in one of her videos, like, oh, upcoming releases to look forward to. And I was like, oh my gosh, I want to read this. I love the illustrations, and the illustrations did not disappoint. This is my second book that I read in Spanish this year, and I actually buddy read it with Kat herself, and we had a good time reading it. Some of the writing was in cursive, and we were like, what is going on? I mean, I know how to write and read in cursive, but the cursive was very challenging. It wasn't as accessible to my eyes as I would have liked it to be, but at the end of the day, I felt it was still a worthwhile read. This graphic novel really reads like a memoir. It follows our main character, Rocio, or Ro, and she's moved into her late grandma's house in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, if I'm not mistaken. And then what follows is a very like dreamlike-esque look at intergenerational trauma, immigration. Her grandmother emigrated to Argentina fleeing fascism in Italy, and it also talks about some really heavy topics that I think you should check the trigger warnings to, and those topics are connected to the patriarchy. This book makes me wonder about inherited traits and just trauma. As much as we can, we should try to have compassion for our elders, even though sometimes we just don't want to take shit from them, and that's totally fine. It is a nuanced look at that, and it's colorful, it has an annoying cat, and I recommend it. So next up we have our little joys, and I admit that I did not prepare for this. But my first joy undoubtedly is that I am really happy that I have become a librarian. I want to do some vlogs. I mean, I obviously can't take you to work, but maybe like a week in the life of a library student or something like that, because I do want to talk about everything that I'm learning in library school. I think that there's this misconception about what librarians do or don't do, and I feel like we should set the record straight. Right now I'm taking 2 classes, and one is about the ethics of information science and like what you do if somebody has a question. It's a very theoretical class, but the professor is great because he does a great job at making things a little more practical. And then the second class I'm taking is a pre-practicum class about the fundamentals of school librarianship. So in that class we're supposed to do 30 hours of a pre-practicum, 10 with an elementary school librarian, 10 with a middle, and 10 with a high school librarian. And I've been learning so much from these observations and from my peers in the class. It's just a lot. It's a lot to handle, taking classes, writing papers, reading everything, watching lectures online, because most of my weeks the classes are asynchronous. But it's also really fascinating, and it really gives me a deeper sense of appreciation for everything that librarians do, no matter where they're at, no matter what kind of librarian you are. And so even though it's been really tough, I wouldn't change it for the world, and I feel like this is my dream job. Of course, if I didn't have to work, I wouldn't work. I'm glad that given that I do have to work, that this is my job. And I can share more about that if you're interested. My second little joy is that I have been to a lot of concerts lately. There was a span of like a month where I went to 3 different concerts. I saw Casey Musgraves. I love her so much. It's the 4th time I see her live. I also saw Magdalena Bay. Dan is a huge fan of them, and It was just really trippy and fun. And then the last concert I went to was a Sabrina Carpenter concert. We had obstructed view seating and it was still a blast. I am a pop music girly through and through, and so that has been really fun, even though I don't like to go to bed late and I don't like to be out at night. And yeah, so those are my little joys. I am so happy to be back on BookTube. My battery is dying and my camera is overheating, so I'm gonna go now. But if you're interested in reading any of the books that I talked about, or if you have any recommendations for me, please chat with me down below. Thank you again if you stuck around, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.